There is a strange pattern that shows up again and again in the research on aging men, and almost nobody talks about it. Two men walk into their 65th birthday looking almost identical. Same weight, same energy, same handshake. 5 years later, one of them is struggling to open a jar, struggling to carry groceries up a flight of stairs, struggling to get off the floor after playing with a grandchild. The other one still moves like a man 20 years younger. Same genetics roughly, same doctor visits, same general lifestyle. So what actually separated them? The answer keeps circling back to one overlooked habit, something eaten first thing in the morning, one specific protein almost nobody is told to prioritize, and once you understand why it works, you will never look at your breakfast the same way again. Before we go further, if you have ever wondered why some people age with strength and others age with fragility, this channel, Smart Psychology, breaks down exactly this kind of hidden science every week, so take a second and subscribe now, because what comes next is going to reshape how you think about mornings, muscle, and the years ahead of you. Let us start with what is actually happening inside an aging body, because the story does not begin at 70, it begins decades earlier, quietly, without any symptoms at all. Somewhere around the age of 30, the human body starts losing muscle mass at a rate of roughly 3 to 5% per decade. It sounds small when you say it that fast, but muscle loss compounds the same way debt compounds, slowly at first, then suddenly all at once. This process has a name, sarcopenia, and it accelerates sharply after the age of 60. By 70, many men have lost close to a third of the muscle mass they carried in their 30s, and most of them never noticed it happening, because the loss is gradual, hidden inside sleeves and jackets disguised as simply getting older. Here is the part almost nobody explains properly. Muscle is not lost because men stop trying. Most men over 65 who lose strength are still walking, still gardening, still doing chores around the house. The muscle loss is not primarily a symptom of laziness, it is a symptom of a biological phenomenon researchers call anabolic resistance. Picture it like this: when a younger man eats protein, his muscles respond quickly, absorbing the amino acids and using them to repair and build tissue. But as men age, the muscle tissue becomes less sensitive to that same signal. The same plate of protein that would trigger strong muscle building in a 30-year-old barely registers in a 70-year-old body. The door that lets protein in and turns it into new muscle starts to stick, and it takes a much bigger push to force it open. This is where the story gets interesting, because for years the general advice was simply eat more protein throughout the day, spread it evenly, do not worry too much about timing. But newer research coming out of labs studying muscle protein synthesis in older adults tells a very different and much more specific story. Dr. Douglas Patton-Jones, a researcher who has spent much of his career studying exactly this question at the University of Texas Medical Branch, found something that changes everything about how older men should think about breakfast. His research shows that older adults need a much larger single dose of protein, and specifically a much larger dose of a particular amino acid called leucine, to overcome that anabolic resistance and actually trigger muscle protein synthesis. Below a certain threshold, the muscle building signal simply does not fire, no matter how healthy the food is otherwise. Above that threshold, something switches on, almost like flipping a light switch in a dark room. And this is where the mystery habit finally comes into focus. The protein that keeps showing up again and again in this research, the one that reliably crosses that leucine threshold in a small, practical, everyday serving, is eggs. Not protein powder, not exotic supplements, not some rare superfood flown in from overseas. Eggs eaten specifically in the morning in a fasted state, after roughly 7 or 8 hours without food, when the body is most primed to actually use the incoming amino acids to rebuild tissue, rather than simply burn them for quick energy. Here is why the morning timing matters so much, and why this is not just about eating protein whenever it is convenient. Overnight, while a man sleeps, his body shifts into a mildly catabolic state, meaning it is slowly breaking down small amounts of muscle tissue for fuel, because no food is coming in. By the time he wakes up, his body is sitting in a kind of biological doorway, ready to either keep breaking tissue down or flip into building it back up. What happens in that first hour after waking largely decides which direction the day goes. A big carbohydrate-heavy breakfast, the kind full of sugary cereal or a plain bagel with nothing else, does very little to reverse that breakdown. It spikes blood sugar, It satisfies hunger for an hour, but it does not deliver the amino acid punch needed to flip that anabolic switch in an aging body. Eggs do. 2 whole eggs contain around 12 to 14 grams of complete protein, meaning they contain all 9 essential amino acids the body cannot manufacture on its own. But the real story is in the leucine content. Eggs deliver leucine in a form and a concentration that lines up almost perfectly with the threshold researchers have identified as necessary to trigger muscle protein synthesis in older adults, especially when paired with a second protein source like Greek yogurt or cottage cheese, to push the total morning protein intake into the 25 to 35 gram range. That combination, eggs alongside a dairy-based protein, appears again and again in studies looking at men over 65 who maintain strength deep into their 70s and 80s. It is worth asking why eggs specifically, rather than a piece of chicken breast or a scoop of whey protein powder, both of which technically contain plenty of protein too. Part of the answer is practicality. Eggs are already a breakfast food, already sitting in most kitchens, already something men are willing to eat first thing in the morning without forcing down a bland shake before their coffee has even finished brewing. But part of the answer is also biological. Eggs deliver their protein alongside a natural package of fat-soluble nutrients, including choline, which supports liver function and the health of every cell membrane in the body, and vitamin D, which plays its own independent role in muscle fiber function, and has been linked in multiple studies to strength outcomes in older adults. A protein shake delivers amino acids in isolation. An egg delivers amino acids inside a whole food matrix the human body has been processing efficiently for longer than recorded history. That does not mean protein powder is useless. It simply means eggs bring supporting nutrients along for the ride that a shake alone typically does not. Think about Robert, 67 years old, living outside Phoenix, a retired electrician who spent decades on his feet climbing ladders and hauling equipment. For years his breakfast was coffee, and whatever was fastest, sometimes just a piece of toast on his way out the door. By 65, he noticed something he never expected. His grip felt weaker. His knees seemed to complain more climbing the same stairs he had climbed for 30 years without a second thought. His doctor mentioned strength training, which he tried briefly and quit, blaming his joints. What actually changed things for him was far simpler than a gym membership. He started eating 3 eggs and a serving of cottage cheese every single morning. Nothing dramatic, just a consistent habit repeated day after day. Within a few months he noticed he could carry both bags of mulch from the truck to the backyard in one trip again, something he had quietly stopped doing without even realizing he had given it up. Or think about a man named Frank, 71 years old, living just outside Cleveland, a retired postal worker whose family had a long history of what everyone in the family simply called getting frail early. Frank watched his own father lose the ability to live independently by 74, and he assumed the same slow fade was coming for him. His turning point was not a dramatic health scare, it was a conversation with a physician named Dr. Lena Whitfield, who explained the anabolic resistance mechanism to him in plain language during a routine checkup, and suggested he restructure his breakfast around a strong protein dose, rather than worrying about counting calories all day. Frank started with 2 eggs and a small container of plain Greek yogurt each morning, something he could prepare in under 5 minutes. A year later, at a family gathering, his adult children noticed he was the one lifting the folding tables without asking for help, something that had quietly become unusual for a man his age in that family. Frank did not train for a marathon, he did not join a gym, he simply changed the first thing that touched his stomach each day, and let the years of consistency do the rest. If a story like that resonates with you, or with someone you know who has started noticing that same quiet slide in strength, share this video with them right now, because the earlier a man understands this mechanism, the more strength he protects before it disappears, and if you want more of this kind of research broken down in plain language, this is exactly the kind of content this channel focuses on every single week. Now let us talk about why this specific window in the morning matters so much more for men than it might for someone younger. Cortisol, the hormone that naturally rises in the first half hour after waking, plays a role here too. Cortisol in the morning is partly catabolic on its own, meaning left unchecked, it nudges the body slightly further toward breaking down tissue rather than building it. Feeding the body a strong dose of leucine-rich protein in that same window essentially counteracts that catabolic pull, redirecting the body toward repair instead of breakdown right at the moment it needs that signal most. Skip breakfast entirely, or eat something protein-poor, and that catabolic window simply runs longer than it needs to, quietly eating away at muscle tissue that took years to build. There is also a myth that needs addressing directly, because it stops a lot of older men from eating enough protein in the first place: the belief that high protein intake damages the kidneys. This idea, while worth discussing with a doctor for anyone with existing kidney disease, has been repeatedly shown in research on healthy older adults to be unfounded. Multiple long-term studies following healthy men consuming higher protein diets found no meaningful decline in kidney function compared to those eating lower protein amounts. For a healthy man without pre-existing kidney disease, the far greater risk to long-term health and independence is not eating enough protein to maintain muscle, not eating slightly more than the outdated minimums many doctors were trained on decades ago. This particular myth has an interesting origin worth understanding because it makes it easier to let go of. Decades ago, researchers noticed that men with already diagnosed kidney disease sometimes did worse on very high protein diets, which is true and remains sound medical advice for that specific population. Somewhere along the way, that finding got flattened into a blanket warning applied to every man regardless of kidney health, repeated by well-meaning relatives and outdated pamphlets in doctors' offices long after the nuance had been lost. Systematic reviews looking specifically at healthy adults with normal kidney function have found no evidence that moderately higher protein intake causes any decline in kidney markers over years of observation. For the vast majority of men reading or listening to this, the kidneys are not the obstacle standing between them and stronger muscles in their 70s outdated advice is. Dr. Stuart Phillips, a muscle physiology researcher, whose work has shaped much of the modern understanding of protein needs in aging populations, has pointed out that the standard recommended daily allowance for protein was designed decades ago to prevent deficiency in sedentary young adults, not to preserve strength and independence in aging men. His research and the research of others in this field suggests older adults benefit from protein intake, well above those outdated minimums, distributed with particular emphasis on a strong morning dose to overcome that anabolic resistance we talked about earlier. This is not a fringe opinion anymore. It has become one of the more consistent findings across labs studying muscle health in older populations around the world. Let us also talk about what actually happens inside the muscle fiber itself when this threshold is crossed, because understanding the mechanism is what makes this stick, rather than becoming just another rule you follow without knowing why. When leucine crosses into the bloodstream and reaches muscle tissue in sufficient concentration, it activates a cellular pathway called mTOR, which functions almost like a construction foreman inside the cell, giving the order to begin assembling new muscle protein from the amino acids available. Without enough leucine present, that foreman essentially stays idle, and the raw materials sit there unused, no matter how much protein was technically consumed throughout the day. This is the entire reason why spreading a small amount of protein evenly across 5 tiny meals throughout the day, a strategy many older men were told was ideal, often fails to build or preserve muscle nearly as effectively as concentrating a strong dose in the morning specifically. This is sometimes described in the research community as the muscle full effect, the idea that once a meal has triggered muscle protein synthesis, adding a little more protein on top of it within the following few hours does not meaningfully extend the building process further. The switch has already been flipped and stays on for a limited window, regardless of extra amino acids trickling in afterward. For a younger man with efficient anabolic signaling, that threshold is relatively easy to reach with almost any protein source. For a man past 65, dealing with anabolic resistance, reaching that threshold requires a genuinely concentrated dose, which is precisely why a small handful of nuts or a thin slice of turkey at breakfast, the kind of light protein older men are sometimes advised to eat, simply is not enough to get the door open in the first place. It is worth pointing out that none of this only matters to men already close to retirement. The anabolic resistance researchers describe as a sharp cliff after 65 actually begins its slow climb much earlier, often in the late 40s and early 50s, long before most men notice any change in strength at all. A man in his 30s or 40s reading this is not too young for any of it to matter. He is simply standing at the point in the timeline where the habit is easiest to build and cheapest to maintain. Waiting until 70 to start caring about morning protein is a little like waiting until a house is already flooding to think about the roof. The men who arrive at 70 still strong are very rarely the men who suddenly discovered protein at 69. They are almost always the men who quietly built the habit decades earlier and simply kept doing it without much fanfare. Strength after 70 is not just about vanity or how a man looks in a mirror. It is directly tied to independence. Grip strength alone has been shown in multiple large studies to correlate strongly with overall mortality risk in older adults, meaning the strength of a man's hands in his 60s and 70s is one of the more reliable predictors researchers have found for how long and how well he will live. Falls, one of the leading causes of serious injury and loss of independence in older men, happen far more often to men who have lost significant leg and core strength than to men who have maintained it. The muscle a man builds and protects in his 60s is not decoration. It is quite literally the difference between climbing stairs confidently at 80 and needing help to get out of a chair. Think about what strength actually buys a man in practical terms. The ability to carry his own suitcase through an airport without stopping to rest. The ability to get down on the floor to play with a grandchild and get back up without needing a hand. The ability to open a stubborn jar lid without quietly asking someone else to do it. These are small moments, but they are also the moments that quietly define whether a man feels capable or feels like he is slipping, and almost none of them require impressive amounts of muscle. They simply require enough, maintained consistently year after year. So here is what this actually looks like in practice, stripped of complexity. Every morning, ideally within the first hour of waking, before coffee becomes the entire meal, eat 2 to 3 whole eggs. Prepared, however, is enjoyable, scrambled, fried in a little olive oil, boiled the night before for convenience. Pair that with a serving of Greek yogurt or cottage cheese, both of which add additional leucine-rich protein, and as a bonus, feed beneficial bacteria in the gut that also play a role in overall inflammation and health as men age. That combination alone, repeated consistently rather than perfectly, pushes most men well past the leucine threshold researchers have identified as necessary to meaningfully trigger muscle protein synthesis, even in a body dealing with age-related anabolic resistance. Consistency matters more than intensity here. This is not a supplement that works overnight, and it is not a miracle food that undoes decades of muscle loss in a week. The men in the research who maintained strength deep into their 70s and 80s were not the ones who did this perfectly for 2 weeks and quit. They were the ones who simply made it a quiet, boring, repeated habit, morning after morning, for years. The body responds to patterns repeated over time far more than it responds to anything done once with enthusiasm and then abandoned. There is something almost hopeful buried inside this research too, because it means the decline so many men assume is simply the price of getting older is, at least in part, something within their control, starting with a decision made at the breakfast table rather than in a gym or a doctor's office. A man does not need to change his entire life to protect his strength into his 70s and beyond. He needs to change what touches his stomach first each morning, consistently for years, and let the biology already built into his own body do the rest of the work. None of this requires expensive equipment, a personal trainer, or hours of free time most men simply do not have. It requires a decision, repeated quietly every morning, to give the body what it is actually asking for, instead of what happens to be fastest or most convenient in that half-asleep moment before the day fully starts. Strength is rarely lost in one dramatic event, and it is rarely rebuilt in one either. It accumulates in small, repeated choices most people never think twice about, and breakfast happens to be one of the few choices every single man makes without fail, every single day of his life, whether he realizes its weight or not. If this changed the way you think about your own mornings, or the mornings of a father, a husband, a brother who could use this information, this is exactly the kind of research smart psychology exists to translate into something practical and usable. So subscribe if you have not already, share this with the man in your life who still has decades of strength worth protecting, and most importantly, start tomorrow morning, not next Monday, not when it feels convenient. 2 eggs, a serving of yogurt or cottage cheese, eaten within that first hour after waking. It costs almost nothing, it takes only minutes, and the research suggests it may be one of the simplest, Most overlooked decisions a man can make to walk into his 70s still strong, still independent, still fully capable of carrying his own life on his own 2 feet. The choice, as it usually is, comes down to what you decide to do starting tomorrow morning.